Welcome to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 88, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. Before I get into this episode, I want to give a shout out to the two ladies, if I understand correctly, two ladies who visited the quilt store here in Kalispell this week and said to the owner that they listened to the podcast. And I wish I had your names, but thank you for stopping in. The store owner was just tickled that you took the time out of your schedule to do that. Although for sewists, visiting a fabric store is never a hardship. I only wish I had been in the store that day so I could have met you personally. I've had a full week of sewing and I got quite a bit done. I really struggle with keeping boundaries around my calendar and my time. Not everyone in my life is respectful of my time, and there are occasions when I get treated like paid staff, except I'm not paid, or I get treated like I'm someone's personal assistant. I think that tends to happen because I'm very organized, I'm very productive, I get a lot done in the time allotted to me, and people tend to take that saying to heart that if you want something done, you should ask a busy person. But sometimes maintaining those boundaries is exhausting. My priorities go in this order. The first one is the little empire that my husband and I have built for ourselves, which includes the construction company and the farm. And sewing runs a close second. I get very frustrated when my schedule starts to look like the tail is wagging the dog, where I'm trying to fit sewing in around other things instead of fitting other things in around sewing. At the beginning of June, I resigned from a board position, and that freed up quite a bit of time. June was a very busy month, and I promised myself that when I got back from Bernina University, I was going to spend the month of July doing the things that I wanted to do, and obviously one of those things is sewing. I can sew in bits and pieces of time. As I said, I'm pretty productive. I don't fritter away time that I could be doing something, even if it's something as simple as ripping a seam or putting in a zipper or cutting a pattern piece out. But I work best on those days when I can devote 6 or 8 hours to working on a project or a couple of projects. When I got back from BU, the store owner and I, the store where I teach, she and I sat down for a conversation about me taking over more of the mastery classes. So I already teach the serger mastery class at the store, which we have scheduled for once a quarter. But there is also a general machine mastery class once a month. And the store owner or one of the other staff people has been teaching that class. And she asked me if I would add those classes to my teaching roster, which would free her up as well as freeing up the other staff people in the store to do other tasks. We also scheduled some ruler work classes and some clothing classes and a few other classes for the next couple of months. So I can confidently say that sewing is my job and I need to protect that time. And it isn't just teaching time. There is a lot of prep work that goes into getting those classes ready. So one of the things I did this past week was I spent a day in the store working on the Bernina 990 sewing machine, and that's their top-of-the-line model that came out last June. I don't have a machine, but the store has one on the floor, and I am welcome to use it whenever I would like. So Bernina has 3 workbooks to go with that machine. One is on quilting, one is on embroidery, and one is on general sewing. I printed all 3 out and got the exercise materials together. So there are a series of exercises in each book, and they required that you prep some fabric with interfacing. So I did all of that and took everything with me to the store, and I sat there for several hours and worked my way through the sewing workbook so that I could familiarize myself with the features of that machine. It's not completely unfamiliar to me because I have an 880 and there are a lot of similarities in the interface, but there are some new features and I needed to be able to demo those features and be able to answer questions if I'm doing a mastery class on that machine. I also knocked out quite a few garments. I made a pair of free-range slacks out of some K-Facet shot cotton. I made the Wrap Me Up pattern by Gail Yellen out of a brushed Hachi knit. And I also made the geranium dress Made by Ray out of more K-Facet cotton. I used the quilting cotton for that one. K-Facet is coming to the store in September for a quilting workshop. And while we have some quilts made out of his fabrics, the store owner's daughter and I thought that it would be fun to have a lot of garments made out of his fabrics too. So that's what I've been doing. I cut out a pair of Linda stretch pull-on pants from Style Arc. That's an older pattern, and I think it's been replaced by the barb pants, which are a similar style, but they have a narrower leg. I cut out a pair of those in some black stretch cotton. I have another pair that I made myself last year, and they are so comfortable that I just find myself reaching for them over and over again. I cut out some rayon batik for another woven top. And this afternoon, after I finish this podcast, I'm going to make a muslin of the Liesel & Co. Amarena dress. The class coordinator at the quilt store asked me last week if I had any pattern recommendations for a good pullover summer dress, and that got me to thinking that I had traced that pattern a couple of months ago, intending to make it up this summer, and I haven't gotten around to it. So if I get a muslin that fits and looks good, I have some red Brussels washer linen. That's a Robert Kaufman fabric, and I'm going to make that dress out of the red Brussels washer linen. I have one more week left in this month. There is nothing on my schedule, so I'm going to be spending at least a couple of days in my sewing room doing some deep sewing. And lastly, I just want to mention that I taught a new class yesterday. We scheduled a Learn to Sew class because on our local social media, I was seeing lots of questions after Joann Fabrics closed about where to buy fabric, where to learn how to sew. And I mentioned to the owner of the store that I thought this would be a good opportunity to kind of capitalize on Joann's demise. So we scheduled a beginning sewing class, and I structured it so that people just showed up, and we provided the machines, we provided the fabric for the pillowcases. We had 8 people. The class was full. We had limited it to 8 people. We squeezed in a 9th one at the very last minute, and every single person in there made a pillowcase. Some people even stayed a little bit longer and made 2. And the ages ranged all the way from 16 years old up to early 70s. So obviously people are interested in sewing, and I'm hoping that we make this a regular class at the store. And I hope that some of these students that I had yesterday become regular customers. Okay, that is enough chit chat. Let's get to the main topic, which is buttonholes. And the reason I decided to talk about buttonholes this week is because the geranium dress has buttonholes on the back of the bodice. I am no stranger to buttonholes, although I don't do them very often, and that's mostly because I don't wear button-up shirts. If I wore button-up shirts, I would be making buttonholes far more frequently than I do now. Buttonholes are one of those techniques, kind of like zippers, that I think people get a little bit scared of. And you've heard me say this before. I don't like it when people say, oh, XYZ is difficult, because it does scare people off. And really, there aren't a lot of techniques in sewing that are difficult. I've done a lot of difficult things in my life, and sewing isn't one of them. There are things that are tricky. There are techniques that take some practice, but I wouldn't call anything difficult. And that includes buttonholes. And honestly, we are so spoiled. One of the things I remember from my childhood is reading. It was either in one of the Little House on the Prairie books toward the end of the series, or it was in a memoir of Laura Ingalls Wilder's life, where she talked about the job that she had just before she and Almanzo got married, where she walked to town every day with Pa, and she went to work at the store where they were making shirts for the men. Because in the late 1800s, if you were living out on the prairie and you weren't married, you had to have some way to get your clothing. And Laura talked about how she spent many a day making buttonholes. She was really good at buttonholes, and someone asked her about that, and she said, I hated to do them, so I just got very good at doing them, so I didn't have to spend a lot of time on them. And if you avoid buttonholes now, just imagine making a men's button-up shirt with maybe a dozen buttonholes, and each one of those buttonholes had to be bound by hand. Let's talk first about the tools that you're going to need to do a buttonhole. And these will vary a little bit depending on the style of the buttonhole. One of my very favorite tools, which isn't really used in making the buttonhole, but it's integral to good buttonholes, and that is a buttonhole gauge. You may have seen old ones in antique stores. It looks like a metal accordion, and it opens and stretches out and it closes up. And when it opens, depending on how far it's opened, you can use the points of the accordion to space your buttonholes evenly. You don't have to go scouring an antique store for a buttonhole gauge. A company called Nifty Notions makes a modern version. To make the buttonhole using a sewing machine, you'll need to check your sewing machine's manual. My very first sewing machine that I got back in 1990 was a mechanical white brand, and I did buttonholes using that machine, but they were not automatic. It was what was called a 4-step buttonhole. So the knob had 4 different positions. The first position did the top bar tack, the second position did the left side, the third position did the bottom bar tack, and the fourth position did the right side. So I had to mark the length of each buttonhole and its placement, and I needed to make sure that I made each buttonhole exactly the same size. Vintage sewing machines sometimes come with a buttonhole attachment, and I haven't ever used the buttonhole attachment on any of my vintage machines, but I do have one friend who had a vintage Singer that she kept set up with the buttonhole attachment on it, and that's all that machine ever did. She said none of her other machines ever made buttonholes as nice as that machine did. Your machine may have an automatic buttonhole foot. My Janome 6600 had an automatic buttonhole foot where you actually put the button into the foot, and the machine made the buttonhole to fit that button. My Bernina 880 has a buttonhole foot, but it doesn't have a place for the button to ride in. Instead, on the interface, you hold the button up to a circle on the screen and you turn the knobs until the circle is the same size as the button, and then the machine adds 2 additional millimeters to make the buttonhole big enough for the button to fit into. And then you can just do as many buttonholes as you would like, and the machine makes them exactly the same size. Something that people don't always think about when they're making buttonholes is to use a strip of interfacing on the placket where the buttonholes are going to lie, or underneath each buttonhole. And what that does is it stabilizes the fabric and it makes a much neater buttonhole. So don't overlook the interfacing. I do know at least one sewist who, when she is making button-down shirts, uses some organza in the placket as her interfacing. So that's an option too. You will need a way to cut the buttonhole open, and many a garment has been ruined at this step. I have a very sharp pair of little Kai scissors, and that's what I use to cut the buttonhole open. I do know some advice has been given that you should use a seam ripper to cut the buttonhole open, but the risk of just zipping right through the bar tack at the end is too great. Even though I have also seen put a pin through the bar tack at the end so that the pin will stop the seam ripper from going through. It's still too big a risk, so I use my very sharp Kai scissors. If you do a lot of buttonholes, you may want to invest in a buttonhole chisel, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a chisel that allows you to cut the buttonhole open with one strike of a mallet. The buttonhole is exactly the correct size, and you don't have to worry about making it too big by going through the end of the buttonhole. Most patterns that incorporate buttonholes also come with a guide to show you where to place those buttonholes, but what happens if you need to place the buttonholes differently or you don't have a guide to go with the pattern that you're making? I pulled out my vintage Vogue sewing book to see what it had to say about buttonholes, and there are quite a few rules about placement. So I'm going to read them to you. The top buttonhole on a center closing is generally placed below the neckline edge at least half the width of the button plus an additional 1/4 inch. The last buttonhole should be 3 to 4 inches from the bottom, never through the hem, and that's in bold italics. Omit the last buttonhole if necessary. Buttonholes are not usually placed closer than 5/8 of an inch from a closing edge. For a large button, the extension from the end of the buttonhole to the closing edge should be a very minimum of half the button's width plus 1/4 inch. The reference point in placing your buttonholes is always the garment center line. Center lines must meet when your closing is fastened. Do not try to alter your garment simply by moving the buttons or buttonholes, as this changes your center line and distorts the shape and fit of the garment. Thus, the center line should always be the first line marked when marking your buttonhole placement. Next, mark the short horizontal lines for the position of the buttonholes, and lastly, the long continuous vertical lines to indicate their length. The same book also gives guidance for the size of the buttonholes. The size of the buttonhole should always be determined by the button. Minimum buttonhole length is equal to the diameter plus the thickness of the button. Add 1/8 of an inch to allow for the shank and a slight size reduction due to fabric thickness. As I mentioned, my Bernina calculates the size of the buttonhole by taking the size of the button and adding 2 millimeters to that size. So for a buttonhole for a 15 millimeter button, the buttonhole would be 17 millimeters wide. And the book continues, in general, attractive buttonholes are slim, about 1/4 inch wide with each lip 1/8 inch wide. They may be slightly narrower for lightweight fabrics and a little wider for bulky fabrics, but the total width of the buttonhole should not exceed 3/8 of an inch. Depending on the kind of machine you have, you may have a menu of a variety of different machine-made buttonholes. We're all familiar with the plain rectangular buttonhole with a bar tack at each end. There's also buttonholes that have a keyhole at one end for a bit more style. My Bernina, I believe, also has a buttonhole that has a triangle at each end instead of a bar tack. And don't forget eyelet buttonholes. If you have a round button, you might want an eyelet buttonhole, or you might need the eyelet to draw a cord through, say on a sweatshirt or another casual type garment. And those can be opened with an awl, AWL. If you don't have one, they're very handy, so you may want to add one to your arsenal of tools. Let's talk about bound buttonholes. You might not ever do a bound buttonhole in your lifetime of sewing, but you shouldn't be afraid of them either, and they can be quite elegant. Bound buttonholes consist of strips of fabric that are either cut on the straight grain or the bias grain. So imagine that you're doing something in a plaid. You might want to cut the strips for the bound buttonhole on the bias just to add a little bit of interest. Bias cut strips also provide extra ease for buttoning and unbuttoning and take away strain from the corners where there is a probability of the fabric pulling out of the seam. I'm reading from the Vogue book again. I've seen several methods for making bound buttonholes, so I'm not going to go into that in detail. You can look up bound buttonholes on the internet and get a lot of YouTube videos and tutorials on making them. The devil is in the details, as they say, and a technique like bound buttonholes is definitely worth the extra time and effort. Corded buttonholes are another kind of buttonhole, and this just means that a thin, strong cord is underneath the thread of the lips of the buttonhole, and although that cord reduces the elasticity of the buttonhole, it does make it a lot stronger. So there are definitely places where you might want to use a corded buttonhole. And check your buttonhole foot, because it may be that it has a place to feed the cording in while it's making the buttonhole, or there may be a separate corded buttonhole foot for your machine. Let's talk a little bit about thread. Buttonhole twist thread does exist. If you have any vintage thread at all, you probably have one or two spools of buttonhole twist thread kicking around. You aren't required to use buttonhole twist thread when making buttonholes. Typically that was used when hand sewing buttonholes. For general all-purpose buttons, a polyester or cotton-wrapped polyester thread is going to be perfectly fine. You can match the color to your base fabric, or if you want to be a little bit more bold and daring, use a contrasting color. You might choose an all-cotton thread, say Aurifil or something similar if you're doing heirloom sewing. Cotton thread has more of a matte finish and blends well with cotton and linen fabrics. It isn't meant for high-stress areas, so you wouldn't want to use it in a coat, for example, but perhaps on a christening gown. If you're making buttonholes in a coat or a heavy denim or a canvas, you might want to use top stitching thread. The key here is that you might have to change your needle to a top stitching needle. You probably should change your needle to a top stitching needle. And you might have to fiddle a bit with the tension adjustment. And here I'm going to talk about buttonhole bobbin cases. This may be true for other brands as well, but I do know that Necky, you know that I have several Necky sewing machines. Necky had both a regular bobbin case and what was called a black latch bobbin case. The black latch bobbin case is exactly what it sounds like. The latch on the bobbin case had a special chemical treatment to make it black, and the tension was set to be looser. Sometimes the process of machine stitching a buttonhole would cause puckering or thread nests, and loosening the bobbin tension in the bobbin case could help to overcome that. Now, we've all been yelled at not to mess with the bobbin tension, which could be good advice or bad advice depending on the situation. I'll tell you that on my Bernina Q20, I'm always messing with the bobbin tension because it has to be adjusted depending on what thread I'm using. So adjusting the bobbin tension doesn't scare me, but if you do a lot of buttonholes, you may want to keep a separate bobbin case just for buttonholes and mark it so that you know that the tension is looser on that buttonhole case. And that way you don't have to keep messing with the tension on your bobbin case if that's not something that you're comfortable doing. And back to thread real quickly, let's talk about silk thread. Silk thread might be a good choice if you're doing hand-worked buttonholes or you're making a couture garment. A silk buttonhole is going to give a very elegant finish. As with so much in sewing and in life, practice makes perfect. Grab yourself some scrap material and some interfacing and promise yourself that you're going to sit down at your machine and set it up to do buttonholes, and you're just going to do 6 or 8 buttonholes in a row. Maybe do 6 or 8 of the same kind, and then grab another piece of fabric and some more interfacing and do the different kinds in your machine. If you have the option to do different styles of buttonhole, try them all out. Adjust the density of the stitches and see if you can find a sweet spot where you think the buttonhole looks absolutely perfect. After you've practiced making buttonholes on your machine, I can assure you that it's going to be much less scary the next time you have to do it on a garment. However, as I always say, test first. So anytime you're going to make buttonholes in a garment, do it with a piece of the fashion fabric first and the interfacing that you're planning to use and the thread, and make some practice buttonholes and see what you think. Once you're comfortable on some scrap fabric, you'll be able to go forth and make buttonholes on your garment with confidence. Did I miss anything? Let me know. I like to get feedback, both positive and negative, although I prefer constructive criticism. You can leave a comment on the show notes page. You can use the fan mail feature, and you can email me at janet@janetzabo.com. The show notes can be found at the podcast website at www.thestraightstitchpodcast.com. My website at www.janetzabo.com has links to my Big Sky Knitting Designs website as well as my blog. And if you're curious about what I'm making, photos are posted on the Instagram account at Straight Stitch Podcast, or you can check out my blog, and there's a link from the Janet Zabo website. The blog is where you get pictures as well as commentary, and sometimes you even get pictures of cute little chicks or piglets. So let me know what you're thinking. We'll be coming up on the 100th episode before too long, and I'm planning on making that a listener question and feedback episode. So if you have a burning question or some feedback that you want to send, let me know, and you might be featured on that show. I am off to my sewing room to make a muslin of the Amarena dress. So until the next episode, I hope you have a great week and that you get to go sew something.